Hi everyone and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. Hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving with your family and friends. Today's episode is sort of a piggyback from episode 75, which was about John Perry Barlow and John Kennedy Jr. And I recently was reading through the inaugural issue of George, which is the one with Cindy Crawford on the cover. And I realized that there's an article inside of here that features John Perry Barlow. So I thought I would highlight that. And if you haven't seen episode 75 yet, definitely go back and check that episode out. And here's the article with John Perry Barlow in the inaugural issue of George. To preface this article, John Perry Barlow was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, but he also did a lot of work in Washington having to do with cyberspace and the protection of speech, particularly on the internet. And this is a conversation between him and Newt Gingrich, who was more for censorship on the internet. And as we can see now, when one party gets in charge of the internet and can censor the other party, we can see how this plays out. So this is going to be a very interesting article, and I hope you like it. This is called A Couple of GOP Guys Sitting Around Talking. John Perry Barlow, Republican, deadhead, and cyberspace pioneer, wants the government to leave his alternative culture alone. Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House and cyberspace booster, advocates traditional, middle-class values. Can they both get along? Barlow ventures into the speaker's den to find out. Barlow starts the article with this: like everyone else, I've been watching the Newt Gingrich cartoon for years. And probably like everyone else, I figured I knew all I needed to know about him. In gathering horror at his mounting successes, I gazed at him through the narrow media aperture, and I could tell that this blow-dried bubba from the burbs of Atlanta meant nothing but trouble for me and the other old hippies of my new aging generation. Trouble for the embattled values of freedom and humanity we'd held dear since 1965. Trouble, too, for the widows and orphans, for the sanctity of the bedroom, for rock and roll, for art in America, and for compassion in general. So I extended him as little tolerance as I assumed he'd show me, given the chance, not quite recognizing the extent to which this made me part of the problem. But that was back when I still thought liberals were liberal, conservatives were conservative, and that reading the papers would make me informed. Now I'm not so sure what to think, because the more I know about the complexities of the non-virtual Gingrich, indeed the more I know from direct experience about what's actually going on in Washington, the less I'm convinced that any of my old models bear a useful relationship to contemporary reality. It's certainly true the old models don't enable one to understand Gingrich, a conservative who is the most radical politician to hold major office since FDR, a libertarian leading a party filled with fundamentalist control freaks, a devout foe of the federal government and probably the most powerful man in it, an intellectual beloved by folks who read the National Enquirer, a dismantler of social programs who has, on his own for years, paid Atlanta Project kids to read books. I should have been better equipped to handle such paradoxes. As someone who spent years as both a Republican cattle rancher in Wyoming and a songwriter for the Grateful Dead, I've got a few of my own. But the literal-minded media condition us to accept only those, quote, truths that have had their paradoxical and essential other halves apertured. Half of Gingrich is as scary a caricature as I could imagine. But in his intact presence, with his apparently contradictory halves dancing dynamically with each other, he presents something resembling a cause for optimism, or at least a reason to reserve judgment. I started to take him seriously after learning that we were both adherents of Alvin Toffler, whose observations about the nature of the nascent information society seem entirely accurate to someone like me, who spends a lot of time working in and thinking about cyberspace. Thus inspired to give him a closer look, I found that Gingrich was one of about 3 people in Congress who understands the potentially profound political consequences of the net. I also found him a far greater advocate of liberty, both public and personal, than he had appeared when conflated with the Christian soldiers who marched near him. After years of thinking him the enemy, I began to wonder what divided us. The answer, of course, is culture, or perhaps counterculture. Though we have a similarly low opinion of the federal government, he really is a blow-dried man from the New South, and I really am an unrepentant old hippie. It's a clear case of Budweiser versus Bud, football versus Frisbee. But though we both believe that culture counts far more than ideology, sitting in his office, I didn't find that gap so hard to bridge. While many of my own cohort will be sure that I've been gulled, I came away thinking that Gingrich is a good guy. Unlike practically every other politician I've ever met, he looked me directly in the eye and told me his truth to the best of his not inconsiderable ability. He didn't pretend to have answers to questions that no one can answer at this tumultuous time. And contrary to what you read in the papers, Gingrich seems to be a man with a large and operational heart. He may believe in some other roads to hell I don't recognize, but he knows that at least one of them is paved by the government with good intentions. John Perry Barlow starts the interview with this: I want you to describe yourself in terms that don't match the old templates, something besides such labels as conservative or Republican. Newt Gingrich replies, well, I don't know that I think in that language. I attempt to be a problem solver at the level of civilizations. What does it take to optimize freedom, prosperity, and safety for human beings? What can we learn from the American experience to do that? And therefore, what should we be doing tomorrow morning? John Perry Barlow says, I know you're familiar with cyberspace. How do you feel about the willingness of some Americans to assume that cyberspace is a kind of American colony and that our experience should be the dominant one in determining the social contract there? And Newt said, the best elements of America are human rather than national. The Declaration of Independence doesn't say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all Americans are created equal. It says all men, and that means all mankind. So if you start with the notion that the Founding Fathers were trying to define a universal structure of self-government as the essential precondition of freedom, to that degree I think American principles apply, as opposed to, say, an absolutist system such as Confucianism or Nazism. Barlow says, but there are other cultures that might not accept the virtue of our virtues. When I talk about freedom of expression in Japan, the translator can't translate that phrase because they have no concept for that. Newt said, in a period of technological change, a more conformist society is at a huge long-term disadvantage. It may be more successful in a temporary period, but it is likely to be less adaptive over a 50-year period. I think our model of liberating human beings in the broadcast sense, allowing people to have an extraordinary range of freedom and allowing them to voluntarily reorganize themselves on a regular basis, optimizes the creativity of human beings. Barlow said, I agree wholeheartedly, but you and I are members of a party that contains, if not a majority, at least a significant plurality of folks who believe it's the responsibility of the government to impose conformity in social behavior. How do we deal with that? Newt said, you have to be very cautious. If, when you say social behavior, you mean, for example, opposition to homicide, Barlow said, that's not what I mean. Newt said, no, but that's social behavior. And Barlow said, I know, but that's the easy part. Newt replies, sure, of course it is. But how and where do you draw lines? I'll give you one we're right in the middle of. I am very prepared to accelerate the accessibility of software that allows parents to monitor or control what their children can get to on the internet. A healthy society sets different boundaries for children than it does adults. Now that's a very specific boundary, but I don't leap from that to thinking that we should therefore control consenting adults. Barlow says, right, I want to tell you how much I liked your statement against the Exxon Amendment to control pornography on the internet. Newt said, but it's important to draw both distinctions. There are some places where you want to control behavior. Barlow said, but wouldn't you say that place is the family itself, in parents' relationship with their children? Newt said, no. I'm saying that in terms of censoring access to information, I'm willing to be much more ruthless with child pornographers and pedophiles. Barlow said, but I wonder to what extent the whole child pornography problem is not another of these problems that exist more on the media map of the world than they do in the experiential landscape. I spend a lot of time on the net, and I've got kids, and I don't see much evidence that this is happening. Newt said, you may want to talk to law enforcement people. Barlow replied, I'm a little suspicious of law enforcement in this area. They're eager to increase their control over this dimension where they don't have any yet. But let's get back to the schism in our own party. What do you do about the facts that the Republican Party consists, on the one hand, of people who are libertarians and very suspicious of government, and on the other hand, folks who are fundamentalists? And Newt replies, most days you try to focus on what brings them together, not what drives them apart. FDR led a party that had Mississippi segregationists and Chicago blacks. At any point in the 30s and early 40s, he could have destroyed the Democratic Party if he had called a convention on the issue of race. His answer was to manage the problems and manage the issues. Barlow asks, what about the possibility that cyberspace is not actually susceptible to control in practical terms? Newt replies, that may or may not prove to be true. Barlow replies, but lately I've been thinking that cyberspace may be as naturally immune to sovereignty as the seas, and Newt said, it could be, and the Royal Navy eliminated the slave trade. Barlow replies, but are we prepared to have the U.S. government in charge of cyberspace if that means that we might also be ceding similar authority to the government in Riyadh? Gingrich said, my guess is that the government of Riyadh does have that authority. Barlow said, inside of physical boundaries perhaps, but plenty of activists that take place inside the net have no physical focus. Gingrich said, but in a larger sense, we're a little bit like people sitting in an English country town in 1700 trying to anticipate whether or not we'll need speed limits if, in 200 years, somebody invents the internal combustion engine. Barlow said, we're already doing exactly that. When the Exxon Amendment passed, it was as if the Senate consisted entirely of pedestrians who decided to set the speed limit for cars at 15 miles an hour because that's a good speed to walk. Gingrich said, I would point out, by the way, that Senator Exxon is a Democrat. Barlow said, I don't believe those labels are meaningful. Gingrich said, they're enormously meaningful, particularly in the Congress. Barlow said, but are they ideologically meaningful? Gingrich said, yes, Exxon is a personally moderate conservative who puts in power people who are very liberal and very government-oriented. In an ironic way, the functional effect of a moderate Republican is to put into power more libertarian people, and in that sense, those labels have an enormous impact. Barlow said, but it seems that the important factors are cultural. On a cultural level, I find hanging out with some of the folks down at the White House very congenial. Ideologically, I don't agree with them at all, and when I'm around the people I'm in agreement with ideologically, I'm uncomfortable. Gingrich said, right. What you have, in a sense, is pop culture liberals and traditional culture libertarians. I agree with that. Barlow said, another area you and I agree on is that in the absence of statutory law, which may prove inapplicable in cyberspace, culture and ethics become the dominant method of ordering society. Gingrich said, oh, sure. In the long run, culture dominates everything. In the long run, a strong enough culture breaks laws, and laws ultimately conform to culture. Barlow said, but then how do you deal with cultural warfare? I may be fundamentally in agreement with you on political issues, but at the same time, I belong to a culture against which your culture has been waging war for at least the last 15 years or so, for holding cultural values we think don't cause any social harm. Gingrich replied, to be honest, I don't have a real good answer on that. I think I really do represent middle-class traditionalists. I may be a more college professor-ish, dinosaur-loving version, but I essentially represent that system. I think the closest comfort I can give you is that I am very comfortable having a counterculture as a counterculture, and I'm very uncomfortable having it as an alternative culture. Barlow said, I agree. I want to live in a society that has enough tolerance to accolade a lot of different ways of being a human. Gingrich said, right, but my ideal model would be a middle-class culture with great tolerance for a counterculture and no civil war between the two. Barlow said, but wouldn't you agree that, given the actual threats to public health and safety, the war on some drugs has been a cultural war rather than a... Gingrich said, sure, but don't jump from that to thinking that I wouldn't wage it. Barlow said, no, I know you would. I mean, I assume you would. But this is the real dilemma that I keep confronting with the emergence of cyberspace. Whose culture is going to rule and how harshly? Gingrich said, I think the question you've got to ask is, how are you going to optimize freedom? Barlow said, freedom for who? Gingrich said, freedom for everyone. And to do so, recognizing that, first of all, it means you have to have a lot of people who invest themselves in sustaining the system. It doesn't happen overnight, whether it's teaching your kids how to read or participating in a volunteer fire department or any one of 1,000 things. This is one of the great lessons of Bosnia. It took about 2 years for them to go from being the summer vacation place of Germans and Scandinavians to being a war zone. And it may take them 20 or 30 or 40 years to recover. Barlow said, do you believe in federal authority? Gingrich said, in the sense that I believe in the Constitution. Remember, in 1794, George Washington was prepared to call out the army to cross the mountains against the farmers who wanted to make liquor without paying taxes. Barlow said, I have a hard time thinking of any federal program we couldn't live without. Gingrich said, eradication of smallpox? Barlow said, eradication of smallpox is probably something the states would continue to fund. Gingrich replied, but there are occasions when you'd like people to do some things on a continent-wide basis, like ensuring that drinking water is potable. I remember as a kid living in Europe the sense of shock that nowhere could we drink tap water. Anywhere we went in America, we could drink the water. In Europe, nowhere. Barlow said, but do you think the benefits of the federal system are sufficient to justify its liabilities? Gingrich said, no. That's why I'm for dramatically shrinking the system. Barlow said, that's a difficult enterprise. In a sense, you're in the same position as Gorbachev was in. Gingrich replied, no, in the same position as Yeltsin. Gorbachev was confused. He wanted to have an open entrepreneurial communism. That's impossible. But I see myself as directly parallel to Yeltsin, Havel, and Walesa. Barlow said, all the folks who still wanted socialism with a human face. Gingrich said, well, look where they were coming from. Barlow said, exactly, and you and I are pretty devout free marketeers. My concern is if the free market is truly a natural system, if its ecology is red in tooth and claw, how do you embed a sense of compassion into it? Gingrich replies, it's important to remember that Adam Smith's first great book is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, not The Wealth of Nations. And in it, Smith describes what he calls the man in the mirror. Every healthy human being has a conscience, and it's looking at yourself and asking, am I really doing what's right, and not, am I really doing what's profitable? Barlow said, but as a society, we have become so legalistic that conscience has withered. Gingrich said, I couldn't agree with you more. Barlow replied, we have also offloaded our consciences onto the government to such an extent that you are thought to lack compassion because you would do away with well-intentioned programs that don't work. Gingrich said, Morris Schechtman wrote a fascinating book called Working Without a Net, in which he described the difference between caretaking and caring. In caretaking, you do something that makes you feel good even if it ruins the person you're trying to help. In caring, you have an obligation to actually find out whether or not it will help the person whom ostensibly you're trying to help. As he said, caretaking has driven out caring. The other great work on this, which changed my life, was Marvin Olasky's The Tragedy of American Compassion. He made the point that in the 19th century, we averaged 1 volunteer for every 2 poor people. Today, we average about 200 families per bureaucrat. Barlow said, the other thing I want to bring up with you is what I call government by hallucinating mob. We have increasingly departed from the landscape and into the map of the TV perception of reality. TV sells the attention of its audience and thus optimizes fear, sex, violence, thereby creating a widespread perception that we are besieged by a crime wave that doesn't statistically exist. We now have 5 times more people per capita in jail in the United States than the People's Republic of China does, and we are still building prisons. You're in a position, though, where if you try to stop responding to this hallucinatory terror, you don't get reelected. Gingrich said, I think that's a Wyoming viewpoint. Barlow said, I live in New York part of the time. Gingrich said, I don't see how you could live in a major city and suggest that there is not a substantial level of violent crime. Barlow said, I walk everywhere in New York without any trouble at all. Gingrich said, I talked to someone the other night who said they knew 17 people in LA who'd been robbed. That's personal friends who'd been robbed at gunpoint in different situations. Barlow said, still, if you look at the law enforcement statistics, you see that crime has been steadily declining over the last 20 years. Gingrich said, it has declined at the margins, but in fact, the probability of getting killed if you're 15 has gone up, and the level of violence among the young has increased. Barlow said, crime's probably a contentious example, but it does seem clear to me that because of TV, the public perceives problems that may not exist. How do you deal with those things? Gingrich said, that's why you have a dialogue over time. Democracies are much smarter over 5 and 10-year cycles than they are over 6-week cycles. You also have to recognize that most of the time, most people have lots of information that may not be true or may be only partially true. You have to decide which 2 or 3 debates matter most this particular year and get information to people in a way that helps. Barlow said, you know, to sit here this close to you, using hippie mystic intuition to assess your character, you seem like an extremely compassionate guy. How do you deal with the fact that you are widely regarded not to be? Gingrich said, I don't think I do. The long-term assessment of who I am will be made by history. I worry about being effective, and apparently I am. Barlow said, if you could transmit yourself through an undistorted lens, what is the central message of your life? And Gingrich said that humans matter one by one, and that having an ordered system of freedom is worth virtually everything. Such an interesting article and interview between John Perry Barlow and Newt Gingrich about the future of the web and what kind of things we're going to allow on there and what kind of things we're not, and how much power the government can have and how much we're going to take it back. So it also gave a lot of insight into what John Perry Barlow thought of freedom and where he stood in terms of how far the government should be involved in our day-to-day lives. So I'm glad and I'm happy to find this article in the first issue of John Kennedy Jr.'s magazine. He had his good friend John Perry Barlow write an article in the inaugural issue, and now you've heard it. So I hope you enjoyed. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.
Magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late-night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process, and while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.